Okay, I want to introduce you now to Jock Given, who is our esteemed presenter today. He comes to us from Swinburne University in Melbourne, and he's been working in the area of communications and media for many, many years, longer than I've been a consumer advocate, that's for sure. So he's an absolute expert. When I first met him, he was heading up the Communications Law Centre back in the day. So, you know, he has got a lot of expertise and experience, and he's going to explain some of the nuances of this media reform green paper and why it's important to consumers. And I mean, some of you will have noticed that over the last 10 years, internet speeds have been getting faster, and the media and how we consume it is really changing. And so more people are downloading and streaming their television rather than necessarily watching it on broadcast or subscription services. So you've probably also noticed how many more people have mobiles, and that there's a lot of changes to regional media outlets as well. And there's a lot of changes that are also affecting various different sectors of consumers. And so that's what we're also going to explore a little bit more in our panel. But welcome, Jock. I'm going to hand over to you, and I'm going to go invisible for a little while and hand the realms over to you. If you we'll see how the sharing goes for the presentation, and then if you need to, we'll do it from one of our locations rather than from Melbourne. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, Teresa, and thanks ACCAN for organising the session. Let me just get the screen shared here. Now, can people just confirm that you're seeing that screen?
We are seeing it, Jock.
Okay, and nothing else, the media reform green paper. So thanks very much indeed. A couple of points just to introduce myself. I work at Swinburne University. I've been working in media law, policy, economics, history for quite a while, but I'm very conscious that on any issue to do with media these days, I'm not sure there's really any such thing as an expert. It covers so many fields, the technology, the economics, the different ways that different people are using different kinds of media and communication services and platforms. They're using them for things that have not much to do with what we might once have called media. So I am interested and have been involved for a long time, but I don't regard myself as anything of an expert in all the areas that are touched on by media these days. I'd also like to thank Giles Tanner, who is on the call today. Spent a lot of years working at the media regulator, is very experienced in this area, especially on spectrum matters, and has been very involved working with us at Swinburne on the work we've been able to do here. So the government released a media reform green paper back in, it said November, but it actually came out in December. And of course, for those who can see that screen, it was blue and not green. It covered a range of areas, but I think that it came as something of a surprise for many in the area. A lot of the issues being talked about are not new at all, but the fact that the government proposed this set of reforms at this particular time in December 2020 came as a little bit of a surprise, certainly to me, but I think to others. They ended up leaving quite a long time frame for responses. So responses, as we will mention at the end, are not due until the 23rd of May, which I think is unusual for a document like this. But I think that also highlights the fact that what was done was put out, in some ways, a large set of ideas, a surprising set of ideas, and it was a kind of invitation for industry, consumers, others to respond. And that's what we're all in the process of doing. So that's the first point. It's a bit of a surprise. The issues that it covers, it calls itself Modernising Television Regulation. And I'm going to especially concentrate on what it proposes by way of changing the transmission system for broadcast television. Touches on some other issues as well, but that's the core of the proposal, I think. I'm going to draw on at least a couple of bits of work that I've done with Giles, one on Inside Story, a shorter version of an article that we published in the Journal of Telecommunications and the Digital Economy in December. And for us, what we were doing, this article was looking at the large question about whether we should be thinking about changing the way we distribute broadcast television. And in our article, we were looking at a wider set of 5 options for that, which we'll come to. The government's green paper is much more focused, I guess, on one of the options that we considered, but it's very focused, I suppose, on a shorter term response to the challenges that the television industry is facing and to the desire from particularly mobile telecommunications operators for some of the spectrum that broadcast TV currently uses. What I think the green paper is really all about is that the long-term sustainability of free-to-air broadcast television in a world where internet streaming of TV is becoming the primary way that many viewers now watch what we would once have called television. Story's complicated, but I think that's at the core of what the government is engaging with. Why is the government especially interested in this? Well, partly because television has been such an incredibly important media service for most Australians, most people around the world for a long time, but it has 2 particular stakes in the future of television transmission as well. It funds 2 of our 5 broadcast TV networks, the ABC and the SBS, and so it pays for their transmission costs. So it's very interested in anything that can be done to perhaps reduce the cost or stop the increase in the cost of transmission for the 2 free-to-air broadcasters that it funds. Its second interest is that if spectrum is reallocated, sold to mobile operators or anyone else, they tend to pay very large sums of money for it. And you might have seen that only in the last few days, an auction of so-called millimetre wave spectrum has raised hundreds of millions of dollars for the federal government. So it has 2 very direct interests in this, 2 direct financial interests in outcomes over and above the importance of television as a media service for many Australians. On the left-hand side, we see the services that we think of as television, or the online versions of the broadcast networks. The 9 networks, 9 Now, the 10 networks, 10 Play, 7 Plus, ABC iView, SBS On Demand. On the right-hand side, we see the logos for the services that are eating an increasing amount of the viewing time once devoted to those broadcast networks. Foxtel, the initial early eater of viewing time, a so-called pay TV service, and now it's sports streaming service, KO. Netflix, Stan, Australian-based, Disney Plus, YouTube, and we could put many more logos up there for the services, the streaming video on demand. Some are subscription services, some are services that are offering content free of charge. Those are the services, the video services that are being delivered online that are taking an increasing amount of the viewing time that was once wholly consumed by broadcast television. Another couple of charts and then we can stop some numbers for a bit. But the rise in streaming video services since they were first launched, subscription video services, since the main ones launched in Australia in late 2014 and early 2015, has been astounding. So in January 2021, so a few months ago, Roy Morgan reported that over 17 million Australians had access to at least one subscription video service at home. Netflix, the most popular of them, but several services there attracting millions of people with access to those services at home. The striking change, I think, in television has been, we've got one more busy chart from Roy Morgan. And if we think about the rise of people paying for television, until pay TV came along in Australia in the mid-1990s, now a long time ago, but for the first 40 years of television's life in Australia, it was free of charge to people who looked at it, who watched it. From the mid-1990s, it became possible to pay for it, but so-called pay TV never rose above about a third of households. So at maximum, about 30% or a third of households were paying for TV. But over the last 7 years, since streaming video services began, we're now at a point where nearly 70% of Australian households pay for at least some television. So that's a remarkable change. All of those years when pay TV only got to 30%, 6 or 7 years, and subscription video on demand has got to 70%. This is, the word revolution is thrown around a lot, but I don't think it's out of place with those sorts of figures. What that has meant, ACCAN members will be extremely familiar with it. What it's meant is people turning to broadband services for video and other purposes, and the take-up of higher speed plans has really surged over the last few years. So as you can see from that chart just reported by the ACMA, by June last year, about 70% of households were taking broadband plans of 50 megabits a second or higher, whereas just 3 years earlier, it was only 16%. So it was a relatively small minority were on 50 megabit per second plans and higher. 3 years ago, by June last year, it was nearly 70%. I think interestingly, in the next table, we see the surge that occurred with COVID, rapid take-up of even more data. So that is the amount of data consumed by NBN users on average. And that really surged early in COVID times, but then within a few months had come back a bit from a peak in April. But the overall story is very consistent. Considerably significant take-up of higher speed services, much greater use of high speed broadband, especially for video viewing. So why are we looking at broadcast TV? Why are we concerned about broadcast TV's vulnerability? I think there are a few reasons. The first we've now talked about. People are watching so much video from broadcasting's competitors. So for the 3 networks, 7, 9 and 10, and their country affiliates, that means that their advertising revenue has not always been falling. Sometimes, some quarters it has fallen, but it's not growing at anything like the rate it once did, and it's certainly not growing at anything like the rate that advertising revenue overall is growing. So television is becoming a smaller part of the overall media landscape. While that's happening, however, the cost of transmitting broadcast television, especially in country areas, does not change. The cost of transmitting services continues to rise, while people are making less use of the services. People overall are making less use of the services provided. At the same time, broadcasters have got to spend more money to meet all this competition from Netflix, from Disney Plus, from YouTube. They've got to make all their services available online. They've got to spend money to ensure that people can find their services in this crowded online landscape. To add a point to each of those, although people overall, on average, are watching less television, there are huge differences across age groups. And I'll come to a slide about that. TV advertising revenue has not kept pace with advertising revenue across all media sectors, but it's still very large and it's still very important because it pays for a lot of Australian programs. Broadcast television is still the major engine of funding for Australian video television programming. And as I've said, the cost of transmitting services is fixed, and it's especially high relatively high in sparsely populated country areas, because it takes more transmitter sites to get to the same number of people. In fact, it takes many more transmitter sites to get to many less people than it takes in the big capital cities. So this is a special question for country areas. So just drill a tiny bit further into the time spent. There's a lot of numbers on that chart, but if we just concentrate, this is for the second half of 2020. These are figures provided by Think TV, the free-to-air broadcasting data organisation. And if we just look at the difference between, we're looking for the difference in how much broadcast television people of different ages watch. So just the bottom line, total broadcast, this is the number of hours per month that people in those age categories watch. So the average for total people, so for all Australians, they watch an average of just over 60 hours of broadcast television per month. That means they watch about 2 hours per day on average. But if you look right over on the right-hand side, people aged 65 and over, they watch 150 hours a month. So they're watching about 5 hours per day, whereas the average for all Australians is about 2 hours per day. And what that obviously shows is that younger people, we just looked at 18 to 24-year-olds, they're watching 15 hours a month of broadcast television, which means they're watching half an hour a day. So 18 to 24-year-olds are watching broadcast television for half an hour a day. People over 65 are watching it for 5 hours a day. That suggests to us that the government's green paper and what it proposes, which is to change the way broadcast television is transmitted, that's going to have a radically different impact on older people from what it has on younger people who don't make nearly as much use of the services. So what does the green paper propose? Well, these are actually 5 options that the paper I referred to that Giles and I published in December. We had 5 sort of fairly schematic options here. The green paper is really pretty much focused around one of those. It's about proposing to use improvements in compression technology, various complications around this, but it's all about trying to get the 5 broadcast networks, ABC, SBS, 7, 9 and 10, and their country affiliates. It's trying to get them to consolidate their current 5 sets of transmission systems onto 4 or 3 transmission multiplexes. So the idea is we consolidate 5 onto either 4 or 3, and that means we free up 1 or 2 blocks of spectrum in each area, and they can be sold off for mobile broadband providers. Other options that we were interested in our paper, we've looked especially at wholesale migration options, Could you move all broadcast television to a direct-to-home satellite platform? Could you move all broadcast television online? Or could you come up with some sort of hybrid? And we felt there are very large challenges with all of these options, but obviously we are now particularly focused on the consolidation option, which is what the government has put in the Green Paper. A very techie slide to show you a little more on what they're really trying to do. You can see the top, the green and gold line at the top. That's the way spectrum was used before we closed down analog broadcasting. So you can see that the green strips are the frequencies in the VHF and UH bands that are now used for over-the-air digital TV broadcasting. And the gold bit, the digital dividend number 1, that's the spectrum that was freed up when we shut down analog TV, and that was reallocated to other providers, and that spectrum, a lot of it is now being used for 4G. In the middle, it's the way television transmission is organised now, and then at the bottom, you'll see the additional spectrum, the potential digital dividend number 2. That's what's happened in the United States, and that's what we're contemplating here in Australia, to shut down television broadcasting on Block D and Block E and make that spectrum available for something else, most likely mobile broadband. Why might we do this? On the left-hand side, the reasons we might think it's a good idea. On the right-hand side, the costs and the challenges. As I indicated at the start, I think that one of the primary reasons this is happening is because the government is interested in finding ways, the government and the commercial operators, regional commercial TV operators, are interested in reducing the cost of broadcast TV transmission. Perhaps this also provides them with an opportunity to improve broadcast picture quality, because as people would know, 4K television is now widely available on streaming services. Perhaps it can help us to, if some services move to online delivery, perhaps it's a way of making more better use of the NBN. It's a way of freeing spectrum for other uses, perhaps raising money through auctions. And also perhaps there's a possibility that broadcast TV, to the extent that broadcast TV services might move to online transmission, or some of it might move to online transmission, that might provide opportunities for the commercial broadcasters to better target, to more precisely target advertising to their viewers, and therefore increase their advertising revenues. On the other side of the equation, the costs and challenges, and at the core of all of this, I think if we are to think that broadcast TV is to move somewhere else, what is in the centre of this is thinking about television's historic role as a medium that was freely accessible to everyone, not just because there was no direct price, it was not a subscription service like the telephone, like buying other kind, or subscription video was freely available, but also governments invested heavily in ensuring that there were transmitters that made sure that more or less the whole population could get access to broadcasting where they live. Other costs and challenges: if TV is going to move, we adopt new transmission technologies, people are going to have the TV sets that can receive it. If services move online at all, if that's one of the ways we deal with the future of television transmission, 70% of households might have 50 megabit a second and above broadband plans now, but there's a lot who don't. There's still a lot that don't, and that's particularly the case across different geographies. So the fundamental issue, we think, is that this question about transmission costs, which the government is keen to address, it is fundamentally about inclusion. The challenge is about how Australia can most efficiently, affordably, continue to make a comprehensive and appropriate set of local TV services available to everyone across not just the capital cities, but the areas outside capital cities, which are so expensive to serve. As part of the work we're doing, David Kennedy from Venture Insights has done an excellent piece of work looking at one option, the extreme option of moving free-to-air television not to a new over-the-air transmission system, but all online. They conducted a survey as part of that, and we were very interested when they asked people to respond. Did the prospect of moving free-to-air television, if that were to occur, if there were to be a change in the way we delivered television, was that a concern? The average level of concern was quite high. People are concerned, people understand the problems of needing to upgrade to a different kind of service. Suggests, as David quotes, that some viewers perceive a significant quality difference between broadcasting and emerging distribution technologies. The Digital Inclusion Index published last year, an annual thing done by supported by Telstra and others, done by people at RMIT and Swinburne University, reminds us every year that the digital divide has not disappeared, and in fact it is substantial and perhaps even continuing to widen for some groups. The paper also talks about significant issues about Australian content. I won't spend more time with that now, because we're keen to hear from all the members of the panel and to get discussion. But one of the crucial roles that Australian TV broadcasters play is they fund Australian programs. Here's a slide of the rare moment back in January when 3 Australian movies, Penguin Bloom, High Ground and The Dry, were all near the top of the weekly box office in Australia. Fantastic result for the local production industry. So for me, here are some key questions. I think that the discussion paper that ACCAN provided to you, I think raises more than this and has done a fantastic job of drawing out the crucial issues for different groups. But it seems to me what is at the centre of this discussion paper is for us all to think about the role that free-to-air broadcast television plays in our lives and in the lives of members of organisations we work for or represent. What would happen? How concerned would they be if the way TV is transmitted were to change? But also to try to think positively about that, as occurred, I think, with the transition to digital broadcasting, and is to some extent happening with some of the subscription video services. Are there new things? Are there ways that we can capitalise on new technologies to improve the quality and accessibility of TV or video services? So that's not just about loss and degradation, that it's about capturing the opportunity of change to try and make things better. So the government is looking for submissions by the 23rd of May, and everyone, I think, we're very interested to hear from other groups today about what you might think about the plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jock. That was excellent. A very good high-level overview of what some of our feedback from members has been, that it's a highly technical paper and they've found it very hard to engage on this topic. So thanks for pulling out the important points for consumers in this. I might get you to turn off the slides now. I'm pretty sure we can make those slides available to people afterwards if they would like them. Yep, okay, good. And also, I probably should also highlight that we've actually done a short summary of the overarching issues as well that we can distribute to members and participants of this forum if you want to do submissions or if you want to share that information with your members. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists, and as I introduce them, perhaps you can take themselves or put themselves on video. Also for people that are participating, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box, which is next to the chat box below, and I'll keep an eye on those and feed them through to our panelists as we go. So Jock has already introduced Giles Tanner, so get Giles to turn on his camera. Giles is the effective dial a friend person who's going to help us without any technical questions today. So thank you so much, Giles, at late notice for joining in on the panel. And yeah, happy for you to turn off your camera and say hi. Maybe introduce yourself a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Yes, your host has just allowed me to turn on my video, so I've just done that. Yes, no, I was a former spectrum regulator, and I worked through the last digital dividend. So I guess when the government started talking about a second one, some of my experiences suddenly became relevant to current policy issues rather than just of nostalgic value for me. But the issues, I think, for the reasons Jock's outlined, are now enormously different than the last time. We really are looking at that context, which I think Jock has described, of a wholesale shift of a lot of viewing online, and yet with the certainty that a long tail of viewers are going to remain very, very dependent on free-to-air television right across Australia. It is fundamentally an issue about social inclusion, as we see so much of the viewer eyeballs moving online. And the Green Paper starts the conversation. I think that's probably the most important thing it does. In fact, it starts a very important conversation which may take years to work through.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Giles, and I'm looking forward to your contributions. Wayne Hawkins from ACCAN is Director of Inclusion. I might just get you, Wayne, to turn your camera on and unmute when the host allows you to, and just introduce yourself briefly.
Thanks, Teresa. That was a really great job. Appreciate your presentation. It was really good. So yeah, from the perspective of inclusion and the disability sector, I mean, there's a number of really key concerns with the government's Green Paper. I think, you know, the primary one is that, you know, there's no discussion in the Green Paper of, you know, the needs of people with disability and the access features that people with disability need in order to be able to access and enjoy television, broadcast television, the same way as other Australians. So I think there's a number of issues there which would be really good to get discussed and hear feedback from the participants.
Okay, so we might next go to Helen Lobban, who's an ACCAN director on our board, but also she heads up our Indigenous Advisory Forum and soon to be experts group that is forming at the moment on communications issue and closing the gap and how we close that digital divide. But anyway, Hera, if we can go to you for a bit of an introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Yeah, so probably Teresa sort of introduced me, but I've been chairing the ACCAN Indigenous Advisory Group for some years now. I'm a woman, so I'm Indigenous myself and an academic and worked as a lawyer and lots of sort of different related areas of research. And I think what sort of comes to mind initially upon listening to Jock's presentation is when we had the digital switchover around televisions, and there had to be a very particular communication strategy for particularly remote communities and Indigenous communities to ensure that when people were switched over, they weren't just sort of turned off and all of a sudden in the dark. So it feels a little bit like that there needs to be an understanding of the different needs and circumstances, and I think, as Giles said as well, the different context of the the Australian population. One size doesn't fit all. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so we might next go to Mohammed Al-Khafaji, who heads up FECA, the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia.
Hey everyone, my name is Mohammed Al-Khafaji, and it's great to be here. Thanks, Teresa, for organising this. Keen to kind of share what I guess some of the migrant communities do, or I guess, you know, how this potentially could affect how they engage with TV, and I guess how this could affect their lives. So looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you. And we might next go to Jennifer Wilcox, who's the seems to be, feels like still new president of ACCA, the Australian Seniors Computer Clubs of Australia. But anyway, Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you, Jock. That was very enlightening, your presentation. Yes, as Teresa said, I'm fairly new at this presidency of Australian Seniors Computer Clubs, although I have been a director for 10 years now. So I've got a bit of a background, but particularly I'm interested in this today as well, because I live rural and isolated on the south coast of Western Australia. So I think a lot of the considerations will be of benefit to learn about for my own personal community, as well as the seniors that ACCA represents. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, and last but by no means least, let's go to Sally Rogers, who also lives in a rural area and also runs a small business in a small area. So lots of concerns there too, I'm sure.
Myself. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Jock, for your presentation. That was excellent. Appreciate that. So yes, I run my own small business, but also work with a lot of small businesses in a small rural village in northeast Victoria. So yeah, really interested to see, learn more about how it will impact myself personally, my business community. Yeah, and so it's going to be very interesting. Thanks.
All right. So we might kick off with a bit of a warm-up question. And I want to go around and just ask the different ACCAN members, you know, how the people they work with, or even the people that they live close by, are accessing media now, and what sort of changes are you noticing? Yeah, so maybe who wants to go first? Or maybe we'll go to Wayne first, so everyone else can think a little bit more first. Wayne.
I was just turning my video back on and the computer was talking when you asked the question.
Oh, okay, sorry, Wayne. So I just wanted to get everybody to give a perspective about the communities they work with and represent, and how they use media now, and what changes are affecting them or not, maybe benefits and disadvantages.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess the key consideration for the disability sector is that broadcast television has been a really contested space for many, many years. You know, there's been a long time struggle to get the access features that people, particularly people with sensory disabilities, need in order to be able to enjoy and benefit from television. And you know, that includes captioning for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, audio description for people who are blind or have low vision, and for Auslan users, Auslan interpreters on television. And those have been it's been a really long struggle to get us to the place we are today with access features. And I think, you know, in the most recent round of discussions with the government, which was in 2017 around the audio description, provision of audio description on broadcast, free-to-air broadcast television for the blind or vision impaired communities. The information that we knew, given that vision impairment is primarily an age-related impairment, that the people that would benefit most from having that access feature on television are older Australians. And as Jock mentioned, you know, the older Australians are the people who watch the most broadcast television. So the idea that, you know, whilst that communities, for many people, still struggle to fully access broadcast television, they still rely on broadcast television as their primary media for, or medium for news and information and entertainment. Similarly, with the deaf community, there's been a long struggle to get captions on all television, and one of the points that is in the Green Paper, where it talks about reducing the requirement for free-to-air broadcasters, at least the commercials, to provide Australian content on their secondary channels. With captioning, we're still struggling to get that embedded in to the same extent across the secondary channels. And I think, when we look at the cost aspects for people with disability with regards to these proposed changes, look at the statistics. The most recent statistics that I'm aware of are from the ACCAN 2018 poverty report, where almost 4 out of 10 Australians who are living in poverty are people with disability, and that's almost 750,000 people. So any of these transition to different platforms or different transmission technologies will ultimately have a cost to consumers. And for people with disability, that cost is amplified because so many people with disability live in poverty. So I think this is a really significant change that the community, potentially will have some very negative impacts. But just looking at it from the other perspective of, what are the potential benefits? We look at those younger people with disability who are very much part of that cohort of younger people who engage primarily online. Transmission of access features is much easier to provide online than it is across broadcast television. There's, I think Netflix is the prime example where all of Netflix content is captioned. All Netflix produced content is audio described, and so when we look at it from the inclusion aspect, those other services, those online services, can provide a much greater level of access for people with disability. So there's both. Just interrupting at an opportune moment. There's both benefits and advantages, but I think we have to be mindful for a lot of people with disability. The cost is going to be really prohibitive if we have to move to different technologies and just different transmission models.
Thanks for that, Wayne. Let's go to Mohammed next.
Teresa, look, I think for our communities, obviously language is an important aspect, and more of the new and emerging communities heavily rely on, I guess, programs that kind of connects them to their heritage and connects them to their culture. So a lot of that means, previously used to be satellite dishes and those, I guess, free-to-air programs. And now that's kind of slowly changing into a subscription-based, I guess, over the internet TV. So I guess it is somehow changing. And I think the way that people kind of find out how to kind of get these programs is through word of mouth, because usually the new and emerging communities are very small, and they try and help each other out as part of their settlement journey. The other main cohort is the older, more established multicultural communities. They've got very, as they age, a lot of them might actually regress. Their language might regress, and they switch to their original mother tongue because of dementia or as part of the aging process. So they will then depend on going back to those programs and making sure that they can still connect and have some kind of connection to their country or to their language, which is very important. I guess, and this is where I think, SBS is really important. The provision of, I guess, language services. We've seen that SBS is trying to kind of do more, I guess, subtitles to some of their most favorite, I guess, shows out there. And some of these reforms could actually be an opportunity for more programs being available in, I guess, more subtitled languages, to be able to make sure that people who don't speak English can actually enjoy Australian content. So there is a great opportunity there that I think we need to, if the funding model means that SBS and the ABC will get more funding, then we would love to see more Australian content in language or subtitled, because ultimately any subscription-based service will add to the cost of, I guess, being able to access these language services, and that's especially hard for older Australians from multicultural backgrounds.
Thanks so much for that, Mohammed. Different perspective. Let's go to Sally next.
Okay, I suppose a couple of things. The main thing I think I've talked about in general is just digital connectivity in general is quite limited where I am, and quite intermittent, and weather dependent and location dependent. And so in the case of an emergency, for example, if we wanted to leave ABC television on for latest news updates, we would potentially lose access to that sort of thing. We're losing our local newspapers, we're losing our local television news service. So not just connectivity, but also just local content. Connectivity aside, assuming we could all get online and we were able to make the most of the changes, possibly if there was availability for community groups to learn to create their own content, could possibly be a benefit of the changes, that we would start to see more localised stories. Also, as a mother of a 3-year-old, it's worrying that how much she's calling lollies candy and things like that already, which is making me quite aware of perhaps she's watching more American content than Australian. So that's just another perspective as well. So yeah, that I have to just keep hope that there'll be more digital connectivity in the future, but that goes hand in hand with education, with running a business, really doing anything. So it's just a reminder that there's some of us only 2 hours north of Melbourne, not necessarily in remote Australia, that are still not connected.
Such a great reminder and such an important perspective, Sally. And I want to go to Hera next, but I just also want to highlight here that Hera's got 2 perspectives, that of Indigenous consumers overall, and then there are remote Indigenous communities that also have some specific requirements. Anyway, go ahead, Heron.
Okay, thanks, Teresa. Yeah, it's sort of very timely. Just last week we had the Indigenous Digital Inclusion Leadership Forum, and so my perspective was very much informed by those participants, but in particular, as a Torres Strait Islander, born in the Torres Strait, lots of family in the Torres Strait as well, there's probably a few things that I have observed just from my own family, my own sort of networks, about how we sort of use TV or watch TV. So in terms of my older family members living in the Torres Strait, and even living in places like Cairns, the television, I suppose, is a form of company. So sometimes there's family around, sometimes there isn't. And so television and, we have, NITV now, and SBS and ABC that are increasingly having more Indigenous shows on them. And so that is sort of a really important part of that connection with the community, because, you know, we don't all live in big extended families in the one house. So that does worry me a little bit. And that's why I said it probably reminds me of when there was a digital switchover. And I remember I was visiting Thursday Island from Brisbane, and I was at my grandmother's house, and there was me and there was my cousin and my uncle, and we had about 3 different TV antenna and this TV, and we were just trying to get something for her to watch. It was like, and he's they're both boat mechanics, and I've got, I reckon I can work a TV, but we just couldn't get something for her to watch in the afternoons or in the evenings. And, so that's really important for that connection. I think the other thing is that, as we all know about the digital divide, it really does concern me that if people don't have access to TV, like Sally, we have dropouts frequently for days at a time of the internet. And so then, islands turn into cash economies because there's no FPOS, it's just so different from the way we live and use media in Brisbane and, and the capital cities. So I think that's understanding the way the media landscape works in different communities, so culturally and socially, and what value that has, which sort of goes back to Mohammed's comments as well, is really important. That for Indigenous communities, media becomes part of our social and cultural sort of fabric, and the way for us to communicate and express who we are, our identity, our language. And sometimes I think that isn't very well understood. And so, those are sort of my key observations initially.
Thanks, Heron. And let's go to let's go to Jennifer now, who's over in WA. Perspective of seniors.
Thanks, Teresa. Yes, at the moment I'm in Perth, and I have an elderly father about to turn 99, and I can relate to what everyone is saying through my father's eyes, and he is definitely mainstream. He does not subscribe to any TV. He lives in our family home, by the way, still on his own. He's probably wondering why I haven't gone down to visit him yet this morning. But he is definitely mainstream, and I don't think he's alone. There's an awful lot of seniors out there who have this negative feeling towards change, and it's the change that they're fearful of, not so much as the end result, and they just like things all in their box. And that relates to things on the internet. They might all do emails or a bit of Facebook to grandchildren or whatever, but actually streaming something or going to iView or whatever, even YouTube, there's that barrier there. And then on the other hand, where I live isn't so much remote, but it's certainly isolated. And yes, we do have intermittent dropouts. The township itself is on fixed wireless, and that everyone is aware that there's very little internet for anything, whether it be streaming or even basic emails, the minute the kids come home from school, because there's such a drain on the bandwidth, and that comes by repeater from inland anyway. I myself live 17 k's out of town, and I've got 3 satellite dishes on the roof. So, if there's severe rain or cloud cover, the signal's lost. So I do just recently have got free to air via satellite, via a Fire Stick, and I do have subscription to Foxtel and have internet by satellite. But it's all very well to say, I will go streaming on your internet, but there is a download quota and there's a speed limit as well. So it's sort of like, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You just got to find a happy medium that works for you and yours. But on the case of the district, really. Sometimes the internet, you know, a lot of rural places have battery backup, as in not battery backup, but, you know, generators, because we're prone to a lot of power outages, not so much dropouts on the internet, but actual power outages. And they can go for a number of days. And the mobile towers and the telephone landline exchange have battery backup. And when the batteries are depleted, well, there's not even any landline communication with the outside world. So a lot of people are really quite concerned about the basics that this sort of has an effect on, rather than Netflix. And now there are people who have Netflix, but certainly, look, with an aging population, that's definitely in the minority, and everybody sort of gets on with their life as we've always known it. They're not really in the city centric frame of mind for their whole life, really.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was excellent. All excellent contributions. I have to say, one of my frustrations recently has been that we now at 7 p.m. on the ABC have a national version of news. And if you want to see your local state-based news, you have to go on iView, and it's not always posted at 7 p.m. Sometimes you have to wait till 8 p.m. or later. And most people don't realize that that's what you have to do. So most of the time, maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the news is quite similar nationally. But sometimes, for example, with the WA lockdown, also with New South Wales having a mascot person who contracted COVID recently, you really need the local version in order to find out, are you going into lockdown soon or something like that. So I know this has been a frustration of mine, and it's not even easy to search, you know, and I'm supposed to be very digitally literate. So it's not an easy thing to do. And that's just a small change in content that I think is, you know, testing the waters to see if we'll download it. So very, very interesting how these trends are already starting to impact. Now we have a question in the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A. It was in both actually. So thanks, Mike Darby. I know Mike, he's from National Farmers Federation. And I know, Giles, you put a response in, but we might just get you to do it as well. But the question from Mike was, when is the next review scheduled after this review? And I know, Giles, do you want to just have a little, I know there's not a lot of information about that, but maybe.
Sorry, Teresa, I don't have the green paper in front of me, so this is not authoritative, but my recollection is that the government is basically putting a deal to the commercial services. It says, if you take the bait, if you take the freedom from spectrum charge, etc., and agree that at some time in the future you'll let us squeeze you onto shared multiplexes so that we can yield a digital dividend, then this is the proposal we're putting to you. We'd have the auction of that spectrum by about 2025. Once again, this is from memory. So what the government was suggesting, I think, is that if the deal was taken up, you'd see things moving quite fast with possibly amendments to law, maybe a white paper. I don't know whether that's mentioned to confirm the long-term direction of policy by the end of this year. The paper doesn't say anything about what would happen if the broadcasters don't take the deal. And from every public utterance I've heard so far, that seems to be what we're going to get from submissions. The broadcasters, whatever they're going to say, are going to say, no, we don't like that deal. I think Free TV and ABC have both strongly foreshadowed that they think the paper's wrong in positing that they can get the same amount of content over this three multiplex model using superior compression. They think it's mistaken. They think there'll be no growth path for the industry. There's an openness, I think, to the conversation with government is what I'm hearing, but I think they're treating it as an invitation to treat. So it's a little less clear what the government will do with that. It's coming into an election year. Let's see what their appetite to really sort out a roadmap for 600 megahertz is, because that's clearly what's motivated them here, I think. So I'm not sure what the next step is in what I perceive to be the most likely outcome of this consultation, which is that the broadcasters are going to say, no, we don't like that particular deal. Can we keep talking?
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Giles. I don't know, Jock, did you want to add anything in there? Or any responses to any of the panelists' comments?
Just a few things, and they're all incredibly helpful comments and useful. I think what everyone's comments reminded me of is that television is different in different places. We talk of it as though it's all television, and we have known for a long time that the television in Australia was not television in the United States or even television in New Zealand. But to hear again and be reminded of how different television on Thursday Island is from television in Melbourne. It's not just this is not tweaking, it is a radically different experience. And I think that's incredibly important for us to understand. But also, as Wayne reminded us, that it's not always, it doesn't have to be worse. That we have been promised all sorts of features, digital technology, new platforms, new devices offer us all sorts of things. And it makes us think that if Netflix can do audio description and captioning on all its content, then why shouldn't we be aspiring to make television better in the future? If that's what one provider can do it, obviously with the advantage of global scale, all of those things, why should we not imagine that rather than setting our policy agenda to see how little can we degrade television in the future, how can we make television better? That feels to me like a more ambitious and optimistic goal. And in that context, I would say, I mean, it's a cliche that these are unprecedented times, but we're hearing what governments are saying about budgets at the moment. Who would have imagined 2 or 3 years ago that Facebook and Google would have entered into deals that are paying real money to news media providers in Australia? Real money, not short change, serious money. Have a look at 9 Entertainment Corporation's reports to the stock exchange at the moment. They're talking about substantial changes in their business as a result of that. So I think that's just one example where it's not to be crazily optimistic about this. Obviously, there are many challenges out there, but I do think it's possible to imagine that good ideas might get taken up, and let's imagine how we can make TV better.
Yeah, excellent little summary there. And I want to also acknowledge that one of our participants, Sally Thompson, has made a really great comment in the chat, just that she lives 4 hours west of Sydney on a major highway, and that she really relates to what Sally and Heron are saying, and living through the bushfires in 2017. With complete internet loss, the ABC radio was the only way to stay in touch. And she says that the digital divide in rural and regional areas is real. And she's fearful that the move to digital dependency will cause a greater disconnect. So thanks for that contribution. Now, I also want to remind people they can ask questions in the Q&A. So please type them in and we'll get the panel to answer them. Now, I just want to have a quick indication from any of the panelists to see whether there was another point that they wanted to chip in that they forgot when they were speaking earlier and they wanted to add anything. If you maybe put your hand up analog wise, and Wayne, we'll go to you, and then anybody else wants to just let me know by waving.
I just on Jock's point about being optimistic and looking for how can we improve television, and I think from the proposal that's been put on the table in the green paper doesn't provide a great opportunity, certainly in the context of access features. One of the contentious issues around audio description has long been the availability of spectrum, because providing a second audio channel for audio description uses more spectrum. And even with the ABC trial of audio description in 2012, there was a lot of discussion about how much of the current programming on ABC was going to be degraded because they needed to take that spectrum and put it into the audio description. At the end of the day, they were able to make changes that didn't actually degrade the programming, or they didn't need to cut off any of their radio broadcasts over the television. But when we're talking about moving to a multiplex and squeezing more channels and more programming into lesser spectrum, it certainly doesn't bode well for the increase in access features that Australians with disabilities still depend on. It sort of makes it sound like, well, that door's being closed because there's actually going to be less spectrum available in this model that's being proposed than more. And I guess possibly Giles would be able to speak to this, with the compression, the new compression technologies that are available. Does that hold true, or is there going to be opportunities for more content, more programming, new technologies? I mean, we hear about 4K, televisions are pretty much the current market product. But if there's less spectrum, will 4K be available through broadcast television and through multiplex?
I can answer that question pretty well. The current platform with 5 channels can't carry 4K. It's not designed for it. It uses a 25-year-old combination of standards, the DVB transmission standard, the MPEG-2 compression standard. The broadcasters have been upgrading it to MPEG-4, which will get more channels through it, but neither MPEG-4 nor MPEG-2 can support 4K ultra high definition. That's the really big TV sets that people are buying now, let alone 8K. So what effect does it have if you move everybody to MPEG-4 and move from 5 to 3 TV channels, as the government's proposing? It means there'll be slightly less data, so there'll be some loss of services or picture quality. That's the kind of advice I'm hearing, and it's a little different from what you read in the green paper itself, which suggests it'll be pretty similar. But what I'm hearing is it'll be less. The benefit of moving all to MPEG-4 is not that great. There'll certainly be no capacity to carry 4K or those more advanced formats. For that, TV would either have to use other technologies. Internet delivery is not so constrained, which is why you can watch 4K on Netflix if you can afford a subscription and like that kind of stuff. If TV upgraded to DVB-T2 transmission on its terrestrial platform, that technology with more advanced compression standards is able to carry higher definition content, so-called high definition with high dynamic range or 4K pictures. So there are potential routes that the broadcasters and the government could upgrade the terrestrial platform. What's proposed in the green paper is not one of them. What it would really do is, the government thinks, allow you to have something pretty similar to what you have today, using fewer channels and giving up some spectrum. What I'm hearing from the broadcasters is no, not even that. Is really going to cut things back. And particularly if the ABC and SBS are squeezed onto a single multiplex, which is an idea that the Department of Communications consulted on in 2015. And I think it's pretty clear Malcolm Turnbull, as Communications Minister, was keen to explore big savings in transmission costs, very, very deep cuts to the number of streams of content ABC and SBS could carry. So no, this green paper proposal is not a route to better picture quality or to more services. Probably it's a step backwards in terms of the size of the package from what I'm hearing, but we'll get a lot more information, I think, once the submissions from industry come out.
Okay.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, that's good. I liked how you managed to do the complex technical side for some of us that want it, and you also managed to summarize it in an easy sentence at the end for those of us that may not get all the acronyms. So that was great. And actually, it's interesting because it feeds into I'm going to take it as a comment, which is on the questions and answers, and that is just that if it leads to less reliability, then there's a bit of skepticism, because ultimately this is a common story for people that are already struggling with reliability in rural areas. But the same person, Sarah, who's also points out she's from New South Wales Farmers, she makes the comment that I'm going to leave out the beginning part of her statement, but because she says she's mature enough to know that once I could just buy a TV and magically there was free-to-air TV, and now it seems I'll have to buy the TV, the satellite, the smart antenna, the modems. the subscriptions to Foxtel, to Netflix, and that is presuming the content of the free-to-air TV will not be charged for. And just she just notes that, you know, it's just a greater and greater cost impost, and yeah, she's just saying we're paying more for less. So thanks for that contribution, Sarah.
Teresa, just run with that for a little second. Look, that's been such a strong theme in several of the panels about the general concern about accessibility of communications in the broad, is what I'm hearing, once you're outside the cities and in remoter areas. I just want to make clear what the Green Paper is and isn't about. It's about what the government's proposing is a restructuring of the way terrestrial broadcasting works. So if you currently have a UHF or a VHF antenna and you watch free TV off air, all that's being proposed is that there will be a retuning of those channels, and you would receive fewer channels and a little bit less content, but your TV will still work and still carry the 5 networks. If you don't have that because you're behind an obstacle, or you're living on a farm or a remote community, you will be dependent on almost certainly the vast satellite backup for TV, and obviously also NBN in remote areas uses either wireless or satellite. Now, none of those technologies are on the block in the Green Paper. The government has been reviewing the vast TV network. It's been doing that for a couple of years now. The department published a report on the future of vast in about 2019, in which it recommended that the government recommit to vast. The government didn't. It actually committed only for a short term to vast without saying it was going to close it. And I think what the government seems to be doing is racking its brains about why it has to pay for 2 expensive platforms addressed to everybody in Australia, both NBN on the one hand and vast and terrestrial television on the other. So there is a thinking going on about vast, but that is outside the scope, as is NBN, the narrow scope of what the Green Paper is proposing, which is to reorganise terrestrial TV for the 23 or 24 million Australians who can get TV off air, as opposed to the 1 million who depend on vast.
Yeah, and this is a common theme too coming through in the chat as well. So we have another comment from somebody in the Northern Territory who says that their ABC radios are already been turned off, and that their communications comes in via vast or NBN Sky Muster. Both are limited during the wet season because of rain fade, and we, with many others, don't have access to the way communications is coming through in the rest of Australia. People keep talking about faster and better, and in our experience that means our service will decline further. The move from analog to digital free-to-air has decreased the quality of picture, particularly during storms. So that's a couple of different contributors. Also pointing out that what people want to know in the cities is different to what people want to know in rural, regional and remote areas. You know, the cattle markets matter in some places, and the grain markets, but the traffic matters in others. So it's a really good contrast, I think, that's being put through. Now we have a question too from David Lindsay to all panelists about the proposal for using the digital dividend. That's the the spectrum made available to establish, and then the sale of that spectrum to willing buyers, probably 5G providers. The funds from that could be used to establish trusts for Australian content and use. Now, Jock, I don't know if you want to introduce that a little bit more and give a bit more background to that, and then maybe we can go to the panelists for a perspective, because I know some of you will care a lot about that.
Yeah, is David able to, as an attendee, is he able to talk a little more on that himself?
We can actually, I think we can move him across. I'm just looking at my brain's trust who's there, the ACCAN technical person. I know beforehand we discussed this as a possibility. We haven't actually done it. So I might just leave them to think about that for a minute while I'll just say something a little bit more. One of the issues that,
Teresa,
oh yeah, go ahead, Heron.
Oh, I was just sort of going to say, I think what I was really interested by Giles's sort of points that he made, and I did really like, because I'm not a technical person, so I really liked the summary at the end. And I think probably from the perspective of you know, First Nations, Indigenous consumers and communities, wherever we are, one of the things that we are always very concerned about is policy change happens over here, and there are implications for policy and program and service delivery in other places. So even though the government does a very narrow kind of discussion paper or issues paper or whatever, what green paper, white paper, whatever they're called, at different times, we always are very conscious that there's always seems to be some implication or byproduct of a change in policy that wasn't necessarily intended or wasn't considered. And so although this is sort of about television, one of the things that we know from lots of other changes that affect particularly remote and rural Indigenous people is that there isn't still really an understanding of just how great that digital divide is. And if we just roll everything online or we just put everything over here, Sky Muster will fix it, and it just doesn't. And so that does, that continues as a concern, that there is this idea. And one of the things that came up at the forum last week was that there's a new Closing the Gap target around digital inclusion. And by 2026, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are going to have equity or parity of inclusion to the rest of non-Indigenous Australia. Now, I don't think anyone thinks that that's realistic or even 5% realistic, but if government policy is made on the basis that that target's going to be achieved, then that's highly problematic. So that's probably something that always sits in the back of my head, is that something happens here and then another problem pops up over there. And so we always have an eye across the whole of the sector, from a remote point of view.
Yeah,
it's tricky.
Yeah, no, such a great point, Karen. And actually, David he's been migrated, he's been transported in as a panelist. So, thanks to Rich. David, go ahead. Would you like to say something about that question?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. I think you can hear me, but not see me. So yes, Jock and others, as Jock explained, the main point of this really is to try to make what's valuable sustainable, financially sustainable, given the very real challenges of the changing of the nature of consumption and delivery of communications content. So one of the proposals in the Green Paper is to use the dividend from the auctioning off of this valuable spectrum to set up 2 separate trusts that would be then used to invest in Australian content, but also in news, especially I think in local news. So we're all searching around for ways to fund Australian content and ways of sustaining local news content particularly. So I'm just wondering if the panelists think that this is a good idea, a good way to address this problem, or if there are some other suggestions about how to deal with these sort of very fundamental problems.
Thanks for that, David. Jock, any more points to add, or will we go to the panel?
Yeah, I'm generally wary of schemes that tie expenditure to particular sources of revenue, because I think governments are generally fairly reluctant to do that. And I think it also, from a policy point of view, it hooks what you're going to do to what you happen to have available from a particular source. And if that source happens to dry up over time, you've got to make the argument all over again. I think that the story is slightly different, where you propose not that you're going to sort of start to fund something for 3 years, but if you actually really do take a very large bucket of money and put it aside and say the earnings from that are going to fund something in the future. I suppose the difficulty is the earnings from anything at the moment are not very great. So I worry about a model that you put in place a trust and you've got to administer and all of that. I think the crucial thing really for me is always to make the case for what do you want to do? What is the program you actually want to spend the money to do, rather than saying, can we can we get a really large sum of money and I'm sure someone will find out something good to do with it. I think we've seen that with the News Media Bargaining Code, where the idea of getting some money from big, powerful, rich companies is good, but we've had lots and lots of argument about who should be entitled to spend that money. And I'm, you know, I don't mind that much that some mainstream media organisations get it, but of course we would love to see it dispersed reasonably widely to a bunch of interesting new emerging people, not just to people who've been in the news media business or the Australian content business for decades. That's such a good point, Jock. In fact, we interviewed the Regional Communications Minister and we asked him about a communications fund. There used to be one that could reinvest for rural and regional and remote communities in the technology and infrastructure they need. There was one created by the sale of the funds from Telstra, the final sale, that got rolled into the funds that were then used post GFC for the establishment of the NBN. So, you know, funds can always be raided, can't they, by successive governments who have different policy agendas. Okay, so now I'm going to, rather than go around the whole panel, let's just indicate whether anybody would like to make a comment about the proposed funds and or Australian content and the opportunities there. I know I chatted to Mohammed earlier today, not to throw him in there, but I know that he's got comments to make about Australian content. So maybe, Mohammed, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Look, like I said before, you know, I mean, depending on what the funding situation looks like, I mean, there is an opportunity that the Australian content might actually be inclusive of multicultural communities and, you know, new shows that actually reflect Australia's diversity in, you know, using language and culture, but also to produce more, I guess, you know, kind of either subtitled shows, some of the, you know, reality shows, or I don't know, like some interesting shows on the ABC or SBS. I mean, obviously they've started doing that with some of the shows that are, or languages that are in high demand, for example, you know, Chinese language or some other languages. I think this would be a great opportunity. If they receive more funding, then they might be able to do that for other languages in high demand as more established communities as they age here in Australia and revert to their mother tongue.
Okay. Does anybody else want to make a comment on opportunities for different types of content if a trust was available? Wayne.
Thanks, Teresa. I think, you know, the comments that Jock has made and are really key, you know, and also what you made about the communications fund being raided. You know, the proposals are so vague and how they've been worded in the Green Paper. It's really hard to understand how they would work or how they would sustain anything and how long they would last. But I think, you know, there's also possibility to expand that. So, you know, maybe a way for the accessibility features, if they were tied to the Australian content or Australian content that was funded through these programs or these grants, trusts, would be required to have the full accessibility features of captioning, audio description, and AusNet interpretation included. Then we would have a much better outcome for Australian content that could be enjoyed by all Australians. So I think there's an area there that could be investigated and how that could be expanded to include all Australians, so that we all have access to Australian content and that identity and culture.
I must admit, one of the things that really horrified me, and I know you too, Wayne, when we were working to get audio description introduced in Australia, and obviously we're still working to get it expanded, but we discovered that there's this fantastic company in Australia that actually audio describes content for British audiences and exports it. So we were horrified that it was happening, but we couldn't get it. So, you know, that was really, really tragic. Anyway, thankfully we're starting to turn that around, but we want to keep it going. We want to keep that trend for audio description going. All right, did anyone else want to comment about particular content? I know, Sally, that, you know, you talked me earlier and previously about ABC Kids, and some of these relate to children's content as well, and the requirements around how much children's content is required and how much Australian content. So it's about quotas as well. I don't know if you have a comment about that. It's okay if you don't.
Oh, no, that's okay. Look, there are advantages to digital and these, and how affordable some of these tools are becoming. So whether that fund could actually make it all the way to grassroots, I don't know. When you look at things, it was probably 10 years ago now, but Outer had a foundation that helped local communities create their own websites. Yes. And that's, that was fabulous for communities. They were so excited to have their own identity, digital identity, whether somewhere in that foundation that would help locals to create local content. If it's not available via WIN or whoever, could it actually go right to small village level and help the kids learn how to do it, help the local community groups how to create content themselves. So
yeah,
that would be really cool to see if that was possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenny, did you have a comment, or Heron, did you want to make a comment?
The only comment that I think of making was along the lines of Sally, in that I've got a few friends overseas and they are like a sponge, just couldn't get enough Australian sort of knowledge. They're not knowledgeable about Australia at all, and if we could have some greater Australian content that was available overseas, not quite to the extent that overseas is available to Australians by any means, but by being in Perth just in the last 2 days, and I have local free-to-air television on, which I don't get at home, I'm absolutely aghast at the, dare I say, trashy type content that is forced down everyone's throat because there's...
Oh no, you've just got on mute, Jenny, and that wasn't us that did that. Oh, you just have to unmute, and it was just after trashy comment that you put on mute. So
it was the trashy content, and I feel that just every channel I switch to while I'm in Perth here, I wouldn't even be bothered putting the sound on. I just have it on for the background. It's not meaningful, and a lot of people overseas have got very little idea of what it's really like in Australia, and we could really turn the tables and sell Australian content overseas as well as have it for ourselves.
That's really good, Jennifer. Really great comment there. Although with the trashy, one person's trashy television is another person's, really
I know, but you sort of have to
must watch.
And do you really need channel after channel after channel? When we left Perth, you had channel 2, channel 7, channel 9, channel 10. Now I've come back after 30 years watching local television, and I have to buy a paper once a week and go through an entire magazine because there's so many channels to choose from. And yeah, it's a whole education, I can tell you.
Indeed, and I've really had to pick myself up on this, because I know Wayne said to me once when I said, well, we don't need audio description for sport or the latest sort of crazy sort of reality TV show, and Wayne pointed out to me, well, hang on, that's your bias, so I really had to accept that sometimes you need access to what everyone else can have access to, so you can be part of the conversation and part of the cultural dialogue that we're all engaged in, even just so you can have an opinion about it, So yeah, no, well, it's definitely different than what it used to be. Now, Heron, did you want to add anything about content and about trust funds?
Yeah, I would just say that I think one of the things, that we've found as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is we don't see ourselves so much on TV, a little bit on SBS, a little bit on ABC. And so there's definitely a greater need to invest in more content. And I know that we create a lot of content ourselves. but there is a difference between content that you make yourself and, you know, the quality of content that gets produced with lots of money. And a great example of that at the moment, there's a show called Straight to the Plate. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but it's a Torres Strait Islander cooking show, which is just airing on SBS or NITV. I don't get, they're mixed together now for me, I have to say. And every Torres Strait Islander person I know is watching it and talking about it and how great it is. And it's because you can, you know, it's a professionally created piece of sort of work. And I think something that's different about often our works, and I think even Backroads goes to this as well, it's not just sort of the trashy TV that's quite kind of cheap and you can put on churn. It actually captures a part of, you know, our identity, our culture, and it has, you know, it's much more relevant for a longer period of time, and people see themselves over generations. And so its value isn't just immediate, but it sort of is in the longer term as sort of a bit of an archive, as we sort of see it. So we're happy to watch things made years ago. People have passed away, but you know, that's kind of important part of our story in terms of who we are. I think the other thing, as well as sort of the quality and creating that sort of cultural or social historical archive, is that when we create our own content, we're just using the skills that we have, and we really need to be a lot fairer in sort of the film and TV industry in making sure that when we're creating rural, regional, Indigenous stories, that they're not just done with people using skills that they've acquired themselves, but there are opportunities for people to get paid to do training, to get paid to be mentored, to do traineeships, to have scholarships or whatever they might be, to travel to acquire skills so that even when they go back, they can create higher quality work. So I think there's a lot more equity across that part of the sector as well, and having this fund focused on that or having some targets around that can create that equity and focus. And I think that's really important in representing all aspects of Australian life, not just us as First Nations people, but you know, farmers and other people that otherwise don't see themselves so much on mainstream TV. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, that's great. It's a really good sort of sum up of the content contribution. And I want to highlight a case study that came up last week during our Indigenous Leadership Forum. That was amazing, where, you know, communities had students sent home from boarding school, Indigenous communities, Indigenous kids sent home from boarding school. They couldn't afford to have devices or all have a broadband connection at home, and so their education was going to stop. But the boarding school made an arrangement with Indigenous community television, ICTV, and if at 3 p.m. every day the lessons got broadcast over television. So all it required was to have a set-top box that allowed you to link into a television service you were already linking into. And so that actually broadened the inclusion and actually enabled these kids to continue their education, so much so that, and everybody loved it so much that they actually had to stop it so that people would come back to boarding school. So it just shows you, you know, that we need all these different options. I just want to change the direction a little bit and have a little bit of discussion about a consumer voice in relation to these issues. So at the moment, ACCAN tends to be very focused on telecommunications issues, and we can get involved in this discussion because it relates to spectrum and this digital dividend that may impact on telecommunications services in a positive or negative way. And otherwise, we tend to sort of restrict our engagement in relation to media-related issues. But there are a lot of consumer issues. As you can see, you guys have had so many great points to make. I just want to know what you think about whether there should be more consultation about these changes that are on the table now, you know, or even more explanation to communities about the impact, and whether you think that ACCAN should be playing a bit more of a role in that regard in the future. But yeah, I'm open to whatever thoughts you might have. I don't know who might like to go first. Maybe I should put Wayne first, because then we can get ACCAN bias out of the way and hear a more open perspective.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think there's, you know, there's a gap in this area. There isn't a representative body, consumer body in this space. I think for many years, policy has been sort of, pushed through from the industry perspective, and very little concern about consumer interests. I mean, even to the point now where I don't think it's even free TV code of conduct is available for public consultation. I may be wrong on that, but I haven't seen any consultation in that area for a couple of years. And I think it is an issue that, for a lot of people, it sort of sounds very complicated and very technical and difficult to engage with. And I think it's, this has been a really good opportunity for us to sort of look at it more from a consumer perspective and not so much from a technical perspective, and just think about, well, what are the benefits and what are the drawbacks of these proposals? So I think there's possibly is a real need for more consultation and more consumer discussion around this, rather than just leaving it for industry and people who sort of understand the complexities of the technology.
Yeah, and I think in the past it's been very much focused on audiences and the type of impact on what audiences, rather than consumers. And now that we're actually paying for our media, it becomes a different conversation. Okay, maybe we can go to Heron to see if she has a perspective about this.
Oh, I don't want to monopolise the microphone anymore.
Oh, okay. No,
I'd love to hear from.
Come back to you, lad.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Sally, maybe you have a perspective about rural and regional people and. Sure. Well, there's a massive crossover again. So much of what we're discussing is still digital inclusion in general. Like, there's so much crossover, and I currently help out, sit on a panel with the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance, which that started out of the conference Broadband for the Bush, maybe 5 years ago. And they seem to be kicking a few goals and have some really good conversations. And we've got Telstra around the table and Google at the table, the Australian Good Things Foundation at the table. So having some of those really good discussions there, and they've already got some funding models and good networks and things. Maybe it falls into there, or vice versa, because the issues are identical if we don't have connectivity. So accessibility to the infrastructure, to the expense of it, to the training of it, all those same things I think are applicable here, as what digital inclusion for education, for health. It's all the same as far as I can, or very similar, lots of crossover.
Yeah, no, excellent point. And yes, the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance have been doing some great work with representing consumers and users and organisations generally to the Digital Technology Task Force that's working with Prime Minister and Cabinet right now. So let's go to Mohammed.
Sorry, just coming off mute. Look, I don't have, I think others have kind of covered everything.
No problem. Jennifer, do you have any comment?
I wouldn't be against saying that to have a roundtable discussion specifically on this particular one. I thought absolutely, like Sally and everyone else has said, that connectivity is the core of it. But I'm also on a roundtable discussion in regard to telehealth. So if there's quite a few of these specific topics that all need the connectivity, and the green paper is, and the TV is one of them. So it really comes down to, you've got your basis of the internet, whatever, and then all the others are really quite dependent on that. So I would think that, consider having a separate one.
Yep, good. And Heron, I know you didn't want to dominate, but do you have any other points? Or it looks like Sally wanted to make another point. No, maybe not. No.
Yeah, I would just agree with, so what Jennifer said, I thought was a great suggestion.
Okay, cool. Let's go to Sally.
Probably lost it. What I was going to say.
Oh
Never
no,
mind.
oh, damn it. Sorry, Sally. Hold on to that thought. It'll come back to you. Wayne.
Question for Jock or Giles. You know, I'm just wondering if the broadcast industry have been consulting, because we've not heard anything, and it seems that this is really an opportunity where you would expect that the industry would want to understand what consumers thought and what their viewing eyes would think around these proposals, and has there been any engagement at that level, because we've not heard of it.
Now, who wants to go first, Giles or Jock? Jock, yep.
Yeah, I think this is a really extremely valuable discussion. I think that the fact that the government put this out as a bit of a, I think Giles's word, a sort of invitation to treat, it came as a bit of a surprise. Here's something we are thinking of doing. What do you think of that? And I think Giles's indication is that the broadcasters, ABC, maybe SBS commercial broadcasters, might come back and say something like, we don't think a whole lot of that plan, but Giles can probably clarify much better than me on that. But to the extent that the government has said, well, here's a plan. If you don't like it, what would you like? You understand our constraints. The cost of delivering broadcast television in country areas is high, and it's not going to get lower, and audiences are moving. In younger age groups anyway, they are moving. That's our story. That's what we've got to deal with. So understanding their constraints, but that getting the kinds of issues that are being talked about today, and I take Wayne's points, but everyone's point, but Wayne's particularly about the work that has been done over a really long period of time about captioning and audio description, to say we don't want the future of television to be worse. We want to capture the moment, to take television in all its sort of best aspects. We want to be thinking about all of television and how we take that forward. So I think that's a great perspective to get into this discussion, because I suspect that there's quite a bit of talking left to go. You know, the people who want the spectrum are obviously not going to go away. So the realpolitik of it has got to be understood. But getting on the agenda, what do you mean by television? What do you want the future to look like? I think that's great perspectives to inject into this.
Giles, did you want to make a comment on that?
I might just make a comment, and also I better declare an interest in making the comment too. I've actually had the interesting experience and the privilege of working with a couple of broadcasters, including ABC and Free TV, on aspects of their response to this. So I've had a fair bit of visibility of how the broadcast industry actually has reacted to the Green Paper. And I think probably what I'd say is that the industry would have preferred a more comprehensive and holistic roadmap building process over a longer period before the government had rushed a solution. And I certainly believe that they envisaged that process would be inclusive of many stakeholders. In the absence of such a process, industry has reacted, I think felt that it's had very little time to respond to the proposal. You would have noticed that after the Green Paper came out, there was pretty shortly afterwards an extension until the end of May. And that was really to accommodate pleas from the TV industry and possibly from other participants as well, that they needed more time to react to the enormous numbers of issues being raised. My sense is, and I can't speak for where they'll end up, but my sense is both the commercials and the ABC would still prefer that there be some more inclusive and holistic process of roadmap building, which is open to a wide range of stakeholders. I also know that Free TV has been quite active in reaching out, but I'm not aware that it's reached out to consumer groups yet. It has certainly reached out to a range of other stakeholders that are likely, I think, to make very major submissions to telecommunications, those sorts of things, to try and build up a picture of where everybody's coming from. So look, I think it's an extremely good point, and my sense is that the TV industry would actually welcome a more inclusive process that actually brought in more voices. Obviously, the issue of social inclusion is at the core of this. TV knows that. TV knows that part of its brand is that it's a socially inclusive mechanism. So it's not going to be uninterested in consumer voices. I think to the contrary, it probably is looking to consumer voices to ensure that government deals in a way with TV which is respectful of the role that it plays in people's lives. But as I say, though, I've been working with some of the broadcasters, and I suppose that may have limited my perspective, but that's what I've seen.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And I think that when we were planning to put this together and realizing that there was a gap that needed to be addressed a bit more, we thought about inviting free TV and inviting broadcasters, but we decided to keep it quite limited and small because we really wanted the opportunity for our members to just come to grips with some of the issues and understand some of the issues and actually assist them, so that if they do want to have the conversation then with free TV and the industry bodies and broadcasters, then they've actually know some of the language and also have already taken a step back and appreciated that actually they do have things they want to contribute and that they can contribute, which I think in summary probably does summarize that, you know, where we've got to, that there's an enormous number of issues and we've only just sort of starting to scrape the top. So maybe we should just go around one more time and see if people have just in 1 minute, one little last comment, and we'll finish up with Jock and then I'll do a quick summary. So I don't know if any, sorry, also should give you apologies. Heron had to leave, and she's actually an academic in her day job and she had to go and teach. So, so yes. Okay, let's maybe start with Mohammed.
Well, thanks, Theresa. Look, I think it's really important to consult on these reforms, and I think really thinking about engaging communities that are going to be affected at the end of the day is critical as part of any reform. And this is such a technical piece of, I guess, reform that's happening, and no doubt that will affect consumers at the other end. So I feel like they have missed that critical component to make sure that people are consulted. So yeah, thanks.
No worries. Okay, let's go to Sally.
Yeah. As you know, it might not have sounded like, but obviously I'm actually a huge digital advocate, and how I got into my current work is because of the opportunities that digital created for those without a budget. So I actually started out in doing it for fundraising and giving community voice. So to see further development in digital is amazing. So I don't want to get hung up on it's just because we're not connected yet. I keep trying to put yet on the end, assuming that it will come. But I don't know how many people out there the thought would have even crossed their mind that free-to-air television would ever disappear or be reduced. Like, I don't think that thought would have crossed most people's minds. I wouldn't at this stage, not just in general public. So yeah.
Yeah, I could imagine it would be quite shocking if they did. So yeah. Jennifer, final comments.
ACCA represents seniors computer clubs, and they have, you know, obviously members who are seniors, so they are already quite a lot of them anyway, digitally literate and embrace the technology and the advances that it has made over the years. So, but seniors generally, that's probably not quite the case. So there's another sort of group of seniors out there that may also need to be consulted with, because it's sort of like two streams of seniors. But I think the fact that ACCA has been asked to be a part of this is really very good. And when something you know, is resolved from here, or even some feedback, it would be great to be able to take it back to the network, because it is Australia-wide and it does cover city and rural, remote, right across. So you know, and it would interest an awful lot of clubs and their members. So I thank you for inviting me to be on. It's been very enlightening for ASCA's point of view, but mine personally as well. Thank you.
You're welcome, Jennifer. Before we go to Wayne, I just want to indicate that there is another significant comment that's come through in the Q&A from the National Rural Health Alliance. So thanks, Luke, who said that he supports the need for equity of access to digital technology in rural and remote areas, because it's not just an issue of watching TV, but also having the ability to access telehealth consultations, especially video-based for health needs, and that they support the draft National Preventative Health Strategies recommendations for multimedia mass media campaigns that link to actionable behaviour change to create healthier social norms and influence physical activity and nutrition in Australia. So taking away public TV takes away this mass media platform, especially for the elderly who watch the most TV. In all this discussion, we need to remain mindful that government health departments and experts are recommending reductions in screen time alongside an increase in physical activity to reduce the rising rate of obesity and to end its associated chronic diseases. Screen time is usually sedentary time, so we have to stand by the need for reducing screen time in general terms from what it is currently. And it's thanks, Luke. I mean, it's really interesting to me because in a lot of this discussion, we often do forget about having choices to not do that as well. So making sure that people are getting their balance in all of this. And maybe some of the trust funds could go towards some of that. Accessing better telehealth, classic example, and better public education campaigns. Wayne, did you want to make a final comment? And then we might go to Giles and then Jock.
Sure, just thank everybody. It's been really, really valuable for us to hear the discussion and the points that people have raised. Really, it's been a great event, and thanks everyone for your participation.
Thanks for the promo there, Wayne. But it will assist us at ACCAN to draft our submission response, that's for sure. So Giles.
Look, this has been a terrific event, and it really alarms me to hear that the paper is seen as a technical paper and therefore one that's hard to get into, because the issues, the conversation the government's starting, and this is really to the government's credit, whatever you think of this first move, they're really vital and they are so critical to social inclusion, particularly for the 30% or so of Australians who don't sit in the metro area watching a VHF TV channel. Really big issues. Also, just wanted to acknowledge too, there was a very good, and this is a very simple issue, but there was a good question on your Q&A about whether or not there'd need to be help for people to retune. Retuning and restacking is an enormous undertaking which will have many ramifications and cause a certain amount of disruption. I don't want to be henny penny because we can and will have to do this sometime, but things like going back and saying this is the kind of assistance that people are going to require if you change TV arrangements, those are very, very important messages, I think, to be putting at the outset. So often those simple comments are the most important ones. Anyway, that's probably enough from me. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks so much for picking that up, Giles. I did see that and forgot about it. But I know when I was first talking to Jennifer about all of this, and she was saying to me that, you know, it's not always obvious what you can get and what you can't get anymore. You know, you might think that you can't receive free to air, but, you know, you get an expert in and lo and behold, it's fine, you can get it. And it's the same with Mohammed was talking to me about how you find out about which different subscription television options are open for people who want services in languages other than English. It's all word of mouth, so it makes it very hard for people to find out what they can access. And it seems to me there's a big consumer education piece that needs to be done. And importantly, Sally Rogers' final comment was bring back Australian Oz style on ABC. So let's go to Jock for some final comments.
That was in response to Luke's comment about getting active watching TV. I know growing up, we used to think it was fabulous watching people doing aerobics on beaches all around the country.
Yeah, you know, it's great. Great suggestion. All right, Jock.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks everyone also for the event. Terrific. I just really concluding for me, it has really highlighted the extent to which the era of television equalisation in Australia is over and has been over for 7 or 8 years now. The period from the early 1990s through until digital switchover in about 2013-14, before streaming video services really started to arrive. That was a period when most Australians, either through the terrestrial services or through the vast satellite system, were essentially getting the same television, or they could get Foxtel if they wanted it. That was a period of relatively equal services for many Australians. It is decisively over now, and the opportunities to get more video are radically different depending on where you live and your economic circumstances. So I think understanding that has been incredibly important, and that perspective is not in this green paper process at the moment, I don't think. I think if you compare it as well with, for the conversations that are going on about media in metropolitan areas, Telstra, I heard Andy Penn say 75% of Telstra's handset sales last month were 5G sets. Telstra will have 75% population coverage with 5G by the end of June. And I'm sure for many people in outside metropolitan areas, that is like Mars, the idea that 75% of handsets could be for 5G. So I think understanding for this process, understanding the different role that free-to-air broadcast television plays for different people and in different places is an incredibly important perspective, and ACCAN thanks for the day, and there is a really important task ahead to inject that.
So thanks to all the panelists. It's an awesome effort from all of you, and especially considering that I think you're all a little bit panicked when I first said I want you to be on a panel to talk about the future of media. But you've done a pretty awesome job for people that think that you're not experts on this, because you actually are, because you're users and consumers of all this media, and so are your friends and your family. And so ACCAN is going to do its best to keep the voice of consumers heard initially in this, and hopefully we can expand that a little bit more, because with convergence there's just no difference between what's broadcast and what's narrowcast or what's internet anymore. It's all coming together, and ultimately I think, like Jock said, it's about trying to make it available to as many Australians as possible, so we can live up to our catch cry, which is making communications trusted, available and inclusive for all Australians, and let's just make it better. So thank you so much, and I'll ask the ACCANers to stay online, but goodbye to everybody else.